Ms. Brown is leading a breakout session this afternoon with your genetic questions. The Amyloid Research Consortium has played a vital role in the development of knowledge about amyloidosis. They've led efforts to describe the natural history and some of the gaps in knowledge that we have about correct and accurate diagnosis of amyloid. And they've played an important role interfacing with the FDA to educate them about what are some of the endpoints they should be looking at in the approval of new treatments for amyloidosis. Ms. Kristen Hsu from the Amyloid Research Consortium will be talking a little bit about the burden that ATTR amyloidosis patients have through a survey mechanism they've done online for both AL and ATTR amyloid. Ms. Hsu, thank you.
All right, hi everyone. My name is Kristen Hsu, and I'm the Executive Director of Research at the Amyloidosis Research Consortium. I'd like to first start by thanking Muriel and ASG for inviting me here to speak today. It's an honor to meet with you all and to be able to share a little bit about our work. So a little bit about ARC, the Amyloidosis Research Consortium. We are a patient-led nonprofit organization founded by Isabel Lusada, a patient with AL amyloidosis herself, who had a vision to make a material and significant impact on the curability of amyloidosis. ARC's model is to work with and across all stakeholders in the amyloidosis community, harnessing the power of collaboration and innovation to advance science and both improve and extend the lives of those with amyloidosis. We pride ourselves on being a science-based patient organization working to de-risk drug development by strategically implementing programs that we believe are critical to better care for patients and to facilitate and accelerate the development and access of new drugs in these rare diseases. The 4 pillars of our work are built around increasing the speed and accuracy of diagnosis, increasing our understanding of the disease, accelerating the regulatory approval and reimbursement of effective treatments, and enhancing the care and quality of life for patients throughout their amyloidosis journey. Now, our team works to make sure that patients' needs are at the forefront of everything that we do, but also, more importantly, that they're driving progress across the community. Each and every one of your perspectives are crucial, and it's imperative that they come together in a meaningful way that can be incorporated into the process of developing, regulating, and delivering new therapies. Earlier this year, we held a meeting with the FDA as part of our public-private partnership to tackle the challenges facing drug development in TTR amyloidosis. To inform this meeting, we designed and launched a survey with the goal of understanding the experience of patients and their caregivers living with TTR amyloidosis today in the setting of new therapies, and ultimately to better understand what today's unmet need is. This was a global survey that we conducted earlier this year and was available to adult patients and adult caregivers of patients diagnosed with TTR amyloidosis. It collected basic demographic information, disease characteristics, health-related quality of life, healthcare resource utilization, and caregiver burden. Now, altogether, more than 390 patients and 74 caregivers took part in this survey. It was global, and we had participants take the survey from 16 different countries. About 80% of those lived in the United States, and then followed by Canada and Europe. The survey was available in 6 languages, and we're working to make sure that each of our surveys moving forward will be translated into different languages and region-specific as well. Now, most of the patients who took this study were male, over the age of 70, college-educated, and retired. A little bit more than half of them had wild-type TTR amyloidosis, and the average time since diagnosis was just over 4 years. The most common organs that were affected that patients reported were the heart, the nervous system, the GI tract, and then less than 10 patients reported that they had heart, or kidney or eye involvement. Now, we hear a lot about TTR primarily in terms of heart involvement and nerve involvement, but we know those two don't occur in isolation. This is a multisystemic disease, and every patient experiences it differently with a constellation of symptoms. More than half of the patients that took part in this study did report multiple organ involvement and different systems impacted by their amyloidosis. You can see that about half of those who had heart involvement also had nerve involvement, and the majority of those with nerve also had heart. It's important to note that about 18% of patients reported having involvement of all 3 different organ systems. And so truthfully, every patient experiences an array of symptoms with their disease. Now, when looking at the disease characteristics based on organ involvement, you can see that the vast majority of patients who had heart involvement alone were wild type. With that said, we did see significant portions of wild type patients who did also report nerve and/or GI involvement. The most common mutation was T60ALA, and the majority of the hereditary patients who participated did report having multiple organs involved. You can see that those with multiple organs involved had been living with the diagnosis for considerably longer, so their disease had progressed. And the majority of patients who participated were either currently enrolled in a clinical trial at the time or on commercial therapy. And there was a smaller group of patients who were able to access combination therapy across different centers. Now, to assess the burden of disease in patients, we utilized the Transthyretin Amyloidosis Quality of Life Questionnaire, or the ATTR-QOL for short. This is a patient-reported outcome measure that ARC developed specifically designed for and by patients with TTR amyloidosis, regardless of whether they had wild type or hereditary, regardless of whether they had predominantly cardiac involvement, nervous system involvement, or GI involvement. Patients were asked about the occurrence of 32 different symptoms and their severity as it related to their TTR amyloidosis. Here you can see the percentage of patients who experienced each symptom over the past 4 weeks, broken out by cardiac symptoms, peripheral neuropathy, GI symptoms, autonomic neuropathy, and other symptoms. Fatigue was the most common symptom reported overall and the most common cardiac symptom reported with over 85% of patients. Shortness of breath was the next most commonly occurring cardiac symptom. Muscle weakness and loss of strength and pain, tingling, numbness in the legs and feet were the most common peripheral neuropathy symptom in over 70%. Sexual dysfunction was the most common autonomic neuropathy symptom reported by more than 65% of patients. And then gas, bloating, and other stomach issues and constipation were the most common GI symptoms reported by more than half. Patients were then asked a series of questions about how their TTR amyloidosis impacts their quality of life across different domains like daily activities, role functioning, emotional functioning, and physical functioning. The scores ranged from 0 to 100, and higher scores indicate the greater the impact the TTR is having on their quality of life. On the left side of the screen, you can see that the highest impact scores, so indicating worse quality of life, were seen in patients with GI involvement, as well as nervous system involvement. Those with only heart involvement, so no GI, no nerve involvement, had the least impact on their quality of life. On the right side of the screen, you can see that the impacts of quality of life were mostly seen in emotional functioning, so the feelings of fear, anxiety, depression, worrying about the future. Whereas the ability to perform daily activities was the least impacted domain by TTR amyloidosis. Now, while the majority of the patients who took part in this study were on treatment at the time that they took the survey, it's important to note that most do not think that the treatment is stopping their disease progression. And that's not surprising. We know that the drugs that are available now are slowing disease progression. About a quarter of patients say that it's helping say that they do feel like their symptoms are improving, and 45% think that their treatment is slowing their disease progression, or they just can't tell, or they're not sure if it's doing anything. I think what this highlights is that while the treatments that are available are remarkable in terms of being able to slow disease progression, there's still a considerable unmet need from a patient perspective that we need to take into consideration with drug development. Now I'm going to move quickly over to what we learned from caregivers as part of this study. So in total, 74 caregivers took part in this survey. The patients that they cared for looked very similar to what we saw in the patient survey. Most of the caregivers were white females over 70 years old taking care of their spouse. Most of the caregivers who took part in this study were caring for patients who had hereditary TTR as opposed to wild-type TTR. Organ involvement was very similar to that reported by the patients, but I will note that 36% of caregivers reported that their patients had involvement from heart, nerve, and GI system, which is about 2 times what we saw in the patient survey. Now, caregiver burden was assessed through the Zarit burden interview. When looking at the overall caregiver burden across different groups of patients based off of their level of organ involvement, caregivers of patients who had all 3 system organ involved reported the highest burden overall, and it was the only group that actually reported having severe burden, about 14%. The majority of caregivers reported a burden that would qualify as moderate level or less. And so this survey highlights that TTR amyloidosis truly is a multisystemic disease, and patients often experience a constellation of symptoms in spite of their treatment. While most TTR patients are on one of the approved treatments, almost half of those feel like they don't know or they can't tell if their treatment is actually impacting their disease. TTR amyloidosis impacts patients' emotional functioning the most, and as well as their family and social functioning, their physical functioning. And the level of multisystemic organ involvement plays a really important role in what their quality of life looks like. The TTR amyloidosis burden extends to caregivers, which are most often the spouses. The caregiver burden is really impacted by by their patients having involvement from both the nerve involvement and the GI system involvement. I'd like to thank each and every patient who participated in this study earlier this year, many of whom I'm sure are in this room. Your perspectives are so important and drive ARC and the entire community forward. If you haven't already, we're in the process of completing a survey right now called our annual community survey. This is a survey that we launch annually. It's available to patients with all types of amyloidosis and their caregivers, and it's meant to monitor changes from the patient community over time in terms of challenges faced achieving a diagnosis, getting access to care, how you're feeling in terms of your treatment, and your overall perceptions as patients. And so we launch this each year. We've got a card that's in each one of your registration bags that has a QR code that you can use to access the survey. It's also up there on the TV screen. It is completely anonymous, and this is data that we use to really define the work that we approach and really to highlight across the community where the unmet need from a patient perspective is. We work with patients a lot across a number of different types of programs, whether they be surveys, whether they be panels, whether they be focus groups. And if you're interested and would like to get more involved, I'm going to ask my colleague Shaki to stand up at the back of the room. Shaki and I will be out in the corridor on your way to lunch. And so if you're interested in getting more involved, please come find us. We'd love to connect. Thank you.